And we are recording with Mr. Brandon Weichert on Tuesday, May 14th, 2024 at 12:16 p.m. Eastern Time. Guys, the episode's on Frank's Speech. Please go there. Please go in the description, check out the sponsors, all that good stuff. You go to the description, you can also get all of Brandon's books. Follow him on Twitter, and I think your website's in there as well. And but yeah, aside from that, talking about the return of Russia, the return of Mother Russia. So what all does that entail other than kind of the general accepted idea or state, not maybe not idea, fact of Putin saying, like the worst day of my life was the Soviet Union falling apart. Now I want to
Yeah.
put it back together. And it's kind of like George Carlin, where he's like, when's the last time we bombed any white people? The Germans. Why? Because they wanted to take over the world.
Right.
That's our
That's
job.
nice. That right.
And this is kind of funny. It's like the Soviet Union's trying to build an empire. It's like, hold on
Yeah.
a second.
Right.
There's only one. Listen, we have 700 bases around the world to stop you from doing that. Like,
And we have LGBTQ as well.
yeah, and we'll
So
do
there
it.
you go.
Yeah, it is, and then someone's gonna have to do it. It's zero sum world, but it is kind of funny where it's like the return of
Yeah.
the Russian Empire, and it's
Yeah.
like, huh?
Yeah.
All right, so
Yeah.
Brandon, take it away.
Yeah, so this is sort of my continuing reporting on what's going on, what's really going on with Russia, because obviously our mainstream media, they're purposely not covering what's happening. Your audience might have heard sort of a smattering of reports in the last 48 hours about this huge shuffle that's gone on in the Putin's war cabinet.
Mm-hmm.
Putin was of course reelected overwhelmingly. Go figure. He took power again. And the first thing he did was shake up his cabinet, which I guess is not that different from what a lot of American presidents do. Even presidents who get reelected tend to fire their old cabinet and bring in new ones. But the point of interest here is that he fired the military man, General Shoigu, and he replaced him with a non-mil as the head of the foreign or not foreign their defense minister. He replaced Shoigu, who was a general in the Russian army, with a non-military guy, and I'm forgetting his starts with a B, his last name, but he's an economist by training. Apparently, he's a very skilled technocrat, this new guy, deeply, deeply faithful to the Russian Orthodox faith. The court, apparently, there are pictures of him, wearing like the Jedi robes of the Orthodox
Yeah,
Church because he's like,
I'll look it up.
he's like one of the
High
lead
priests.
high priests of his church or whatever the equivalent of that for, like a, I guess like a, whatever we call it in the churches here, and I'm forgetting now. Where you're
Well, his name, sorry, Cardinal.
not a cardinal, but where you're a
Pope,
member of the
Deacon,
church. Deacon, yeah, he's like the equivalent of a deacon. Yeah, thank
Andrei
you.
Belousov, B E
That's it, Belusov.
L
Yes,
O U S O V, Andrei
I
Belousov.
almost said Belushi. That's why I stopped
Yeah,
myself.
same, whatever. It's good enough.
But he's apparently so people in the West. It's been interesting. The few times it has come up in Western media, they sort of dismiss it as like, well, clearly the war is going badly and it's a really bad move because Putin's not putting a military man to run the war. He's putting an economist. And I'm sitting there going, actually, it's brilliant.
Well, and there's also precedent for that, right? Who was SecDef under candidate out? Why am I
McNamara.
Mac? Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. No, he didn't. He come from like Ford or something.
Yeah, he was the Ford. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
He was. They called him a walking IBM machine.
and then
Yeah,
under was it? I think it was Reagan or Carter, the head of like the Missile Defense Agency. I think was Chrysler.
right, right. You're right. Yes. And now I'm forgetting his name, but you're right. Yes. And so I actually, the way we report on Russia in the West is so ridiculous because this is an
Comical.
excellent point you bring up is that, yeah, Americans, non-military people, we've had academics, we've had business people running the DOD here. And so why would we expect Russia to always have a military man running their defense ministry? And in fact, if you look at his background, the new defense minister, his background is actually really well suited for what Putin needs because ultimately war is a game of, or modern conflict is a game of logistics. And what we've seen in the battle of logistics, of competing logistical chains, is that contrary to Western reports, the Russian logistical base, their defense industrial base, is doing much better than the Western industrial base. They have really become a true wartime economy in Russia, whereas Europe and Canada and the United States are still sort of in this 1990s end of history era. And it shows. And so, actually, putting this guy in charge of the defense ministry is brilliant because what he's going to do is he's going to be able to take the advances that have happened in the last 2 years in making Russia a true dynamic wartime economy. He's going to be able to streamline that and marry that to the needs of the Russian defense ministry and carry that on, have real throughput from the defense industrial base through the bureaucracy all the way to the battlefield. And that's going to, in the long run, I believe, translate to a very decisive victory over Ukraine by the Russians. I don't say this because I'm pro-Russia. I just say this because I'm an analyst, and this is how I'm, analyzing the situation as objectively as I can. Because ultimately, I really don't care as an American. I don't
Hmm.
really care about Ukraine or Russia. It's just not
No,
my problem.
no. It's like the meme where it's like Hamas is like, or Palestine's like, you must choose a side. And then it's like Israel's like, you must choose a side. And Americans like, no, I don't. I hope you kill each other. I
Yeah,
don't.
and
It means nothing to me. And it's
yeah. I
doesn't
mean,
mean
these are sovereign countries.
yeah,
The way
exactly. They're adults.
right,
If if
exactly.
if you see my
Exactly.
podcast start spiraling, you might reach out and be like, Tommy, you all right? And if I'm just drinking and angry and yelling at you, you'd be like, hey, listen, you're an adult, you've got a family, you got a support system. I wish you the
That's right.
best. But you're
That's
not
right.
you're not losing. So you have your own family. You're
That's
not
right.
this
And
is the
and
world,
that's
right?
how I view whether we're talking the Russia Ukraine thing or we're talking Israel Hamas. I am sympathetic to Israel, but I always tell people, look, if you're a non-interventionist, you shouldn't be wanting our government to restrain Israel or encourage Israel. They're adults. And they're a democratic society. Let them figure out what's best for them and let them do what they need to do and just shut up about it.
Yeah.
And so that's how I view the whole that situation. But similarly, Russia and Ukraine are sovereign countries. They're at war. These two countries are going to do what they think they need to do in order to win this war. And right now, it looks like the Russians have the advantage, and they've had the advantage for about a year. And no one in the West, the people who are supporting Ukraine in the West, have had the gumption and the intellectual honesty and the moral courage to say, we're actually making it worse for Ukraine. All the money we're flooding in there, all the supplies and weapons we're giving them have not made a difference. The situation has deteriorated still. What we're now finding is, and they're in the last 48 hours, the Russians have taken another city in northern Ukraine on the road to Kyiv. So they're basically going to invade Kyiv again, and this time I think they'll have a lot better of a chance of winning than they did 2 years ago. And what we found is that this small village that they took, which was key, actually, the reason that it folded so quickly to the Russians is because all those hundreds of millions of dollars we just sent over there in the last 2 months, a lot of that was allotted for the defense of this particular village. And it turned out all the Ukrainian city officials were taking that money and putting it in their own back pocket rather than
What?
investing in the
What are you
city's
doing? What?
defenses.
What are you saying? You really? I don't buy that. I
So
don't
you're
buy
a competitive guy, and you know that victory in any sport or conflict belongs to the side that wants it more.
Yeah.
And it looks to me like the Russians actually want it more.
Yeah.
Okay. You look at you. I mean, and I know you've had Lee Slusher on a few times, and you've had him on with me. And if you look at the refugee flows and you look at the population or the depopulation of Ukraine, they've lost something like 50 or 54% of their population in the last 2 years to refugee outflows or to combat deaths. Whereas Russia has not suffered anything similar to that. You
50%.
do, yeah. It's 50. It was they. I think they had think they lost. I think they had I think it was around 49 million people or 50 million people.
No.
They've lost like 28 million people to refugee migration out of the country and to combat losses as well. I think it's like 54% that they've lost. And I know it's in my new book, The Disaster of Our Own Making, the exact figure, but I don't have it off the top of my head. But
By
it's
May
substantial.
2022, it was wait, by May 2022, so 2 years ago, 6 million had left and 8 million others had been dispersed within the country. So that was 2 years ago.
Yeah, but
Or what is the number now? Yeah. Oh
it's
no, no, yeah, yeah.
significantly more now. It's significantly more now. And I want to say it's like 50% now. They've lost, it's an insane amount of population density they've lost. Russia's not lost anywhere near that. In fact, we talk about the people who have fled Russia because of the war. They're usually liberal dissidents who were always the minority. They were not the majority of people. And if you look at what's going on right now, I saw a tweet from Adam Kinzinger, who's not really the brightest bulb in the box, but Adam Kinzinger is out there tweeting the Russians. I think he said lost 456,000 people in the war so far since the start of the year, and he was saying, and we've lost nowhere near that many after 20 years of fighting in Afghanistan. Well, that's an apples to oranges comparison, of course, right? I mean, the Afghanistan war, the Iraq war, these were considered low intensity counterinsurgency conflicts. You're not supposed to have hundreds of thousands of troops being lost in a short period of time, lots of equipment being lost in a short period of time. What you have in Ukraine is a high intensity conflict between two conventional forces. Now, obviously, Ukraine is using asymmetrical capabilities, but they're still considered a conventional force in many respects. So that's a high intensity conflict. You're supposed to have large numbers of people being lost in a short period of time. And the Russians have managed to make it work. And so I'm not saying this because I'm getting off on saying this. I'm saying this because what we are doing in the West is prolonging a terrible situation. And it's not we, the people, who are paying for it at the end of the day, it's innocent Ukrainians. And if we are really committed to Ukraine, this kind of national project of Ukraine, we have an obligation to stop the bleeding, because otherwise, if it keeps going, there won't be much of a Ukraine left to protect. And that's where we're headed. Putin has wanted a deal for 2 years, and we keep telling him no. Well, now he's in a point politically at home where he actually can't negotiate. And I don't think he's going to negotiate. And I've said this to you before. The window for negotiation was that Istanbul conference that Lee Slusher and I were talking about the last time we were here. But those days are done, because now Putin is totally mobilized for war, and he has a political objective now. He has to break Ukraine, otherwise he will suffer, with his own people. So he's going to push forward, which is why you're now seeing this massive offensive cutting through the north of Ukraine.
I had sushi with my parents last night, and my mom was trying to pick up this piece with chopsticks and had like avocado on it, like pulled
Yeah.
off the top. And then she kept pulling it and like pulled out the middle, and then like the rice was collapsing, and she's picking it up. And I was just like, Mom, use your fingers. And she's like, I don't want to. And I was like, as I kept watching, I was like, Mom, this is painful to watch. Just pick it up. And that's kind of like Ukraine and Russia right now. At certain points, like, just pick it up, because by the end of it, it was just it was destroyed. And
Yeah.
I was like, I was like, just pick it up. Like, that's kind of Ukraine and Russia right now. It's like,
And
dude,
let me
what are
let me
we doing?
actually let me
Yeah.
actually offer a correction to something I said. I said it was about half. It's actually about 1/3. According to the EU Science Hub from last year, Ukraine has lost 1/3 of its total population to this war, either in the form of refugee outflows or combat deaths. Just so your audience has the accurate information.
So then what is there to do, right? So that's how you and I look at it. And we're saying, if we're, and just the general idea itself is like, well, we got to defend Ukraine. It's like no one knew what Ukraine was 2 years ago. Like the idea that all of a sudden, now I also understand that I'm not a military analyst. I don't have access to classified information. Who knows? Maybe in 50 years, it's like, oh, wow. Yeah, no, I mean, our defense of Ukraine, prevent a world, whatever. But in general, it's just like, it's an idea that like didn't exist to you. We just got out
Right.
of nation building in the Middle East, and we've all been like, that was an absolute horror
Right.
show.
Catastrophe. Right.
Never again. And I mean,
But
half on a
we weren't saying, Tommy, let me just correct you.
yeah,
You and I and normal people who have rational thoughts were saying never again to nation building. But the Washington D.C. crowd, I used to work with these guys. They've never learned, because they were never made to pay either in
there's
the
no repercussions,
right. Right.
right?
This is, yeah, yeah. And so they never learned. They weren't saying never again. They were trying to just bite their tongue long enough to find another conflict they could use these tools in, and they found Ukraine. It's interesting. This all ramped up within, like, I think, 3 or 4 months or 5 months of the end of the Afghan war.
August
Suddenly the
2021.
Ukraine war erupted. Right.
It's the only thing, and I don't even mean to be I'm not even trying to be funny, but it's like I quote the comedian Tim Dillon more than I quote like authors, but he said like, no, we care about this because they're white and their cities look like ours. He goes, you can only look at so many grainy videos of Syria or Yemen
Right.
or Afghanistan of a JDAM hitting a 9,000-year-old
Right.
temple, or you go, yeah, no, it's sad, but it's like they're walking around with goats with bells on their, but he goes, you look at Kiev and you go, that looks like my neighborhood. They
Right.
have gas stations with
Right.
fluorescent lights. You look at the people and they go,
Right.
they have blue eyes. And you go,
Right.
oh man, we got, and it is just
Right.
truly, I mean, at the core, it's like the greatest manifestation of our own racism. But like, I'm not trying to sound like some woke, but it's just like that or, oil. It's like, what are the things we're really protecting?
Right.
Ukraine, you could say Russia oil trade, or you could
Right.
go Taiwan semiconductors.
Mhm.
It's okay, sure, maybe that's the cold calculated where maybe you sit down with some generals in a bunker and they go, yeah, no, we don't care about this. That's all PR. We have to do it. Like,
Right.
grow up. And it's like we have to do
Right.
this because, hey, do you like your rent how it is right now? Do you like do you like being able to get groceries at this price? This is what your world's based on. You don't have to
Right.
like it.
Right.
And that might be and it might be like,
Well,
I don't know,
yeah.
man. It's hairy.
Yeah, and I outline in my forthcoming book, which is coming out October 22nd, on this issue. The we can strip away all the humanitarian stuff because ultimately, you're right. It comes down to cold hard geopolitics, like it always does. The cold hard geopolitics behind the Western mindset with getting involved with Ukraine was Russia has only 4 warm water ports that they have access to after the Cold War. Those 4 ports, 2 of them, or 3 of them rather, are outside of actual Russian territory, like the contiguous Russian territory. It's really only Vladivostok that's in Russia itself. The other warm water ports, one is in the Kaliningrad, which is that tiny strip of land between Poland and Germany that the Russians have held since 1945. Okay. Then there's the warm water port in Tartus, Syria. Then there's the warm water port in Sevastopol, Crimea. And the real reason for why Russia was so gung ho for years after the Cold War about not letting NATO into Ukraine or not letting Ukraine into NATO was primarily geopolitical because they knew after the Cold War there was an arrangement where the Russians leased the Sevastopol, the Black Sea Fleet is based out of, their legendary Black Sea Fleet. The Ukrainians own after the Cold War, they own Sevastopol, but they would lease the ancient naval base that the Russians built under Catherine the Great. They would lease that back to Russia. Well, in 2010, there was an almost it almost worked. The West tried to get that lease canceled in favor of putting NATO boats in that base. And so ever since then, the Russians have been obsessed with preserving their hold on Sevastopol and Crimea. And the reason NATO is so intent on getting into Ukraine is because this is part of a larger strategy, and I think it's also why we got involved in Syria. We're trying to push quietly the Russians back to their medieval borders. And so in order to do that, they've got to lose their base in Syria, their warm water port in Tartus. They've got to lose their warm water port in Sevastopol, and they're going to at some point have to lose their warm water port in the Kaliningrad, which is on the Baltic Sea, if they are to be pushed back. And that is, I think, the secret objective here of NATO. And I think that's the secret mission of Russia to preserve their hold on those things.
I just looked it up. I got it wrong. California's deep water port, right? Well, it's also warm, but there's a difference between
Yeah.
deep water and warm
Yeah,
water.
warm water port's a deep water port, but it never ices over. And so Russia,
Gotcha.
for centuries, going
Yeah.
back to Peter the Great, there's been this push by Russian, leaders all across time. We've got to break the ice. We've got to leave the iced over ports. We want to have a great navy, and the only way you can do that is if we have access to warm water all the time. And that's why they've extended their reach to these different places.
So then let's play devil's advocate. You and I are both, clearly of like, yeah, this is all BS. But how much of it is like a kind of a grow up moment? Like when you get pulled into the bunker with the generals.
Yeah.
It's like they look at you and they just go, "What do you think all of human history is?" Like, yeah, yeah,
Right.
we dress it up and we wrap it in the flag and
Right.
not America. I mean, every country. And it's like what do you think it really is? It's actually
Right.
much deeper than anything. It's not that you don't care about you. There's actually much more hits to home. How do you like
Right.
filling up your gas tank? You like having
Right.
food? You like having money left over to take the kids to McDonald's? That's like, and it's hard to look at that and go, is that worth human? Is that worth human life? And then they go, well, what about humans that you've never seen before in a country you
Right.
didn't know existed 2 years ago? It gets very
It does.
gray.
It
And
does. And but the issue right now, in my view, unlike other conflicts that we fought, where we're generally, I think, on the right side, even though there's the geopolitical consideration as well, we tend to try to do the right thing. I think a lot of times there's debate there, but
sure.
okay, but the point is with this, I actually think the West is in the wrong
Hmm.
because we have, and I document this in my next book. We basically, the end of the Cold War was when NATO went on an expansion spree. That was the moment it actually should have stopped expanding because NATO was developed on paper to stop the Soviet threat, to stop the Red Army from invading. And it worked. The NATO was an essential element of our national defense, forward defense in Europe, and it saved the world, I think, from a Soviet invasion of Western Europe. I think it really did. After the Cold War ends and the Soviet Union collapses, Russia's not a communist country anymore. That was the threat in the Cold War, was the spread of communism. Those days are done. We're back to now just old school Russian imperialism, which actually can be managed with a minimal amount of effort, I believe, especially because they can't compete with us economically, for instance. At least they couldn't at that time. What you see is from 1991 onward, NATO goes on this expansion spree, and it's clearly aimed at absorbing not just the Baltic states, but it's aimed at absorbing Georgia in the South Caucasus, which is not even in Europe, not even the North Atlantic, as well as the big prize is Ukraine. And the reason is because if you're a Russian, you're looking at this going, well, they won't let Russia into NATO. They keep telling us one thing and then doing another thing. They tell us NATO's not going to expand, and then they do. And then they won't disband NATO and make it part of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. They keep expanding the power and scope of NATO bureaucratically. So clearly, this is not just an anti-Soviet communism group. This is an anti-Russia group. And so what you've seen now is after years of not just Putin, this goes back to Gorbachev. Gorbachev, Yeltsin, and Putin, all three of those men, and Medvedev, all four of those men, all said the same thing over the last 30 years. Don't expand NATO. And if you are going to expand NATO, don't expand into Ukraine. And that was the one thing we did. We kept trying to expand into Ukraine. And finally, Putin snapped. And what that has done is actually, you talked about the price of everything. That's actually our actions over the last 30 years put Russia into this defensive minded position where suddenly they're being surrounded on all sides and they have to lash out now, otherwise they'll be crushed. That has actually triggered a war in the Ukraine, which has caused the price of goods, notably food, to go up. And it's actually harming Americans now with our pocketbooks because now we're having to pay much higher prices for things at the grocery store in an already bad economy. And so, when we talk about geopolitics, we're actually in the wrong on this one, not just because we're sort of triggering this fight, but because ultimately it's having knock-on effects that are, I believe, hurting more Americans and Europeans than they are hurting the Russians. The Russians, as I said, they have adapted to a wartime economy. It's not pretty, but it's good enough. It's good enough for them to survive. And the importance of this new cabinet that Putin has selected, most of these people are not only technocrats, they're very skilled, but they're also China experts, which indicates that Putin is moving fully ahead with his plan to marry Russian power to Chinese power. And so this is a critical problem. Our decision to keep expanding NATO, not listening to Russia, treating Russia like a pariah even after they overthrew our great enemy of communism, has actually led to a place where we're paying higher prices, we're risking World War III, and now Russia's moving into the waiting arms of our real enemy, which is China.
Which I personally think is by design on our part. But
You do. That's interesting.
yeah, no, I do. I think we're pushing Russia into China's. I think we probably just speaking for myself, my tinfoil. I think we probably instigated Russia into Ukraine.
Yes.
I think that we want Russia to, because we tried it out 4 years of Russia bad under Trump, so that
Yep.
groundswell is already there. I think they're saving. I think they're saving the they have it. They've had it since day one. The evidence that COVID came from China. We're gonna
Yep.
wait until Russia is into China, where the Overton window of acceptance of, we just we get out of Afghanistan, and then it's, February 2022. It's now we're funding Ukraine, and then October last year, now we're funding Israel. And then the last 2 weeks, it's like now we're funding Taiwan. So we're just the general Overton window is being accepted that we are now funding these places, these hubs of democracy. We have to save it. And we're slowly going to push them all together, Russia and
Yep.
China. And they're the bad ones. And,
Yep.
you just very quickly, without any real logic, throw Iran in there and be like Israel, Hamas, it's a thing. And we're
Don't forget
pitting
Venezuela and Guyana as well.
I think, and I've talked about this with Vince Lancey before. I think we want a Cold War too. A big
Yep.
enemy. You don't. Wars are, you get 5 years out of World War II. No, you want a 50-year Cold War.
Yeah.
You want just, shut up. We need this. It does. It's not morally good, but it's just kind of human logic. It helps ease divisions at home. We got to beat the Soviet menace. We
Right.
gotta, we gotta do this. We gotta and then objectively, if you're like a real detached, cold, calculating psychopath at the top, don't I think there's like some
Most of
study.
them are.
Well, they all are. I think there's some
Right.
study though where it was like, without the Cold War, we would have gotten the iPod scroll wheel by like 2018.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, what if you are just playing this chessboard and you're like,
Right.
how do we advance humanity even faster?
Right. Right.
You might say Cold War, and it's a tightrope. And you go, well, if you mess up and you slip off, you fall, there's global
Right.
thermonuclear Armageddon, it's all over. And you might say, well, whatever, I'm not here to experience it. None of
Yeah.
this is like me condoning it, but that's what I
No,
think
but
we're doing. I think we're pushing it to a
Tommy,
Cold War to accelerate technology. I legitimately think that.
yeah, I think you're onto something. I do. And I've gotten to know, I know you know him, I've gotten to know Ashton Forbes, and
Yeah, I
he's
love
done
him. He's the
some
coolest. He's the
wild
coolest, man.
stuff.
Yeah.
But and you and I have talked on your show previously before I knew Ashton about the truth about exotic technology. Is it aliens or is it no, it's not. I think it's stuff that we captured from the Nazis, and I think we've been reverse engineering and
For
augmenting it for the
80
last
years.
80 years. And
Yeah.
so I think you're right to some degree. Yeah, no, definitely. Here's the problem though with the Cold War, and this is where I differ with people like Neil Ferguson, the great historian, who I knew once upon a time. Um, he has been running around saying we're in Cold War 2.0. And I sort of tweeted at him, just kind of tweaking him a little bit, saying, if we're only so lucky. And the reason I'm saying that is because the Cold War, yeah, you had China, yeah, you had other actors who were communists helping the Soviet Union, but ultimately it was really a dual fight. It was America versus the Soviet Union, US versus USSR, blue team versus red team. Everything was sort of subordinated to those two poles. It was a dyadic conflict. So it was more manageable actually. What we're talking about now is a multiplayer melee and or melee. I can't speak today. But of multiple actors, multiple powers, kind of ideologically aligned. Sure, they're autocratic, but really, their real big thing is anti-Americanism, not wanting us meddling in Eurasia and their backyard, and also a lack of communication between the military elites of those countries and the United States. And what that would lead to with all these different players with multiple options and multiple outcomes now, what that leads to is Cold War rapidly devolving into a nuclear war. We have way too many players now. And so I keep telling people it's not a Cold War. I don't think. I think it's the beginning phases of a world war. And God help us, because it's not going to be World War II speed and movement, and one side is absolutely good and one side is absolutely bad. It's going to be World War One. It's going to be static. It's going to be canceling each other out. It's going to be bloody, and it might end, with a total annihilation.
Well, and then you might have people. that do this for a living, not to, venerate them as like infallible, but let's just, profession, it's,
Right,
if I want advice on health, I, text one of the doctors. If I want
right,
to know how to shoot, I text Dale from Delta Force, right? There's
right.
some people who've dedicated their life. They might be looking at this and going, no, you're correct. It is a multipolar world. It's very hard to calculate, which is why we're pushing it into a cold. It's like when
Yeah.
I'm, and like,
No,
yeah, I
I
have my
hear you.
daily
I
to-do
hear you.
list every day. And it's like, I have stuff that is like absolutely vital. Go to the gym, shower, shave, put on clean clothes, meditate, get on the podcast. Then I have other stuff. I have to make thumbnails, Zoom invites, descriptions, and I like to get it all done before in the morning when I'm still just going fast. But if I'm running late or if I wake up late, there's order of operations. I'm like, I don't want to do it later when I'm tired, but I can do all of that later. Right now, I got to go to the
Right,
gym, meditate, clean clothes, Brandon. Right?
right.
They might be looking at it and be going like, take all this crap and just like sorting laundry, just go like east west, east west, east west, and
Yep,
don't let it turn
yep,
into multipolar. Be like force people to take sides,
yep.
and that
And
might
if
be what
that's the case, it's kind of scary because if that is, and I think I honestly think you are onto something. And I think that if that is the game plan, I think the Western elites are going to be in for a very rude awakening because we're already seeing the global South. What
Yeah.
is it? What is it doing? It's not siding with America. It's not siding with Europe. It's siding with the Chinese, the Russians, and the Iranians. And in fact, I was actually going to post this on Twitter. I just found it right before I came on with you. There's a video of the head of the EU's foreign policy group. Borrell is his last name, Borrell, and he has in February of this year was quoted as saying that if the situation between Europe and Russia and China persists, Europe in particular, but the West in general, will find itself completely cut off and isolated from the global South, which will give major advantages to Russia and China.
it might be. You also might have people looking at this, and you and I are making the assumption of like, I don't know how America's going to win. They might say it's not going to win. We're trying to keep the species from going extinct. We're going to
Right.
turn it into a Cold War, and then we're going to kind of let them win. And that's unforgivable treason. But they might also go, well, what would be higher than national survival? And you might
Right.
go on like a moral level. You might be like humankind, right? And
Well,
it's
yeah, and don't
I'm not
forget.
saying that's what's going on. I think again
No, no,
because
I know, but
I think they're demons from hell that
right,
have sex with little kids on islands, which is provable. So I'm not exactly like, and they're like
right,
scrubbing their
right,
halo and being like, we must do it for man.
right,
I don't really believe that, but just as an
right.
idea.
I think they're doing. I think you again. I think Tommy, you're probably onto something, and I think that we also have to remember. You and I have spoken about this before when we talked about my book Biohacked. Um, the World Economic Forum, which is sort of like the meeting place for all these nut job elites in the West, they increasingly, and most of these internationalist groups like the World Health Organization and the UN, even, all these groups are increasingly taking on the Chinese view of politics and human life, which is that human life is expendable. We only look at the group, not the individual. What the individual needs is irrelevant. We have an ideology that is a globalist, communistic ideology, and we will impose it by force on the people we supposedly rule over. And you see that playing out. So I think you have, to some degree, this poison, as Nixon said, this poison in the minds of America's elites and the Western elites. It is that is completely warping their worldview and actually making them comport with the standards and wishes of that communist element, the Chinese element, the authoritarians in Russia. They may not even realize it. And so, you could be witnessing, and this was sort of why I was, saying the return of Russia and the end of the West, because on its own, Russia, it's not really going to, unless it goes nuclear, it's not going to end the West. But what it can do is show everyone, and it is show everyone in the world everything the West says is wrong, and they're not powerful enough, even with NATO, to stop Russia from imposing its will upon Ukraine, which will then translate to the global South saying we don't want to rise with our former colonizers anyway. And if they're already weak, why wouldn't we go with the group that's saying they're going to have our back and has a history of not imposing their will on us? Of course, it's not true. I mean, the communists in the Cold War, the Russians are imperialists, the Chinese are terrible with human rights and all that, but that's not how the global South is viewing it. So, to your point, I think you might be right, is that if we're going to shunt everything into East versus West, Cold War 2.0, it might end with our elites willingly surrendering to the authoritarians.
And, to correct myself about, not really thinking that they would do it for humanity, there might be a way to make it work and be like, yeah, they might be looking at themselves as Operation Paperclip. Let's go get
Right.
us. It's not America, but hey, we're gonna go have a
And
nice
that's how
little,
China views it. That's how China views it.
yeah,
Absolutely.
to,
Absolutely.
give them the bridge to retreat across. I mean,
I mean, this is why, I we talked about this with biohack. When my wife was at Yale doing her PhD in genetics, all of her fellow PhD students in genetics were contacted by multiple state-owned genetics firms in Wuhan. This was
mm,
long before anybody in
yeesh.
pop media knew about Wuhan. This was back 2014, 2015. And so she was contacted repeatedly on her yale.edu email, which meant that it had authorization through the Yale sort of organization to send this. And they were recruitment, pitches. Come work for this lab in Wuhan or Shanghai, and you'll be given top of the line research equipment. You'll be getting the first name listings on any academic publications. That's very rare for a new PhD student to be given that in these prestigious journals. And also, as a signing bonus, we'll pay 100% of your student loans completely off. And now,
That's a
that's
that's
amazing.
insane. Well, I mean, as an undergrad, I did I co-authored research, and I remember as like a freshman, it's just because I
Right.
had a high grade in biology. My professor, I was like, yeah, I'm not really interested in like aquatic toxicology for fish. She was like, I know you're not. She was like, you can be a co-author on a paper as an undergrad. She was like, if you
Right.
want to get into med school, that's
Yeah.
your golden ticket to
Yeah.
co-author a paper as
Right.
and I did that, and that's like I remember with being interviewed, they're like, your GPA is not as competitive, but this is basically your golden
Yeah.
ticket. I didn't go
Yeah.
to medical school, but had I gotten in, the one I got into in Miami was 80,000 a year, 8160
Yeah.
320. Imagine offering me the publication
Yeah.
and going 320, here's your check.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And the reason my wife tells me all the time, the only reason she got into the PhD program at Yale is because she was a Jonas Scholar for the NIH as a master's student at George Mason.
Hmm.
So, and she was teaching also genetics courses at George Mason as a master's student. And so, but she had a lot of student debt. Now, she obviously being with me, there was no way, and we were going to ever take that deal. But a lot of her cohort did. A lot of the next generation of American genetics leaders have done at least a part stint in China, partly because their student loans were being paid off. And you can bet that China's not going to let those scientists go after the student debt's paid off and after they've done their contract with. They're going to try to keep them there, keep them working for China, doing all the advances there. So you're right, it's a reverse operation paperclip on an even grander scale. And
Hmm.
Western academic institutions and Western companies and Western investors are helping China to do this. And so
Hmm.
you're right. This is, the reverse brain drain. This is the rise, not the return of Russia, the rise of China, but it's the rise of a new world order that has an autocratic Eurasia at its center. And, we're seeing their power being demonstrated against us, physically in Ukraine. But there's also this soft power stuff going on that China's doing behind the scenes. And in both instances, we're losing.
Hmm. Um, yeah, then I back to the NATO thing, not to derail, because I want to make
No,
another
no.
point about Ashton, but when you're saying like the Cold War ended, that's when it should have stopped. Is
Mm.
that is that a naive view? or is it like, no, what's the patent? Not the one that we fought the wrong enemy, the other one, like, let's pursue them to this, let's go
Right.
beat the Soviets. And now we look
Yeah.
back and we're like, man, what if we had done
Yeah.
that? We would have, you know,
Yeah.
at what point were they looking at that and going, now's our chance to rectify it? Like, hey, full court press. They're down, they're
Yeah.
tired,
No, I get it. I get
steal the
it.
ball, push them, blitz. Like,
Yeah.
is that you and I mean, again, rationally, you and I are like, yeah, it's over. Or their general's like, no, here's an opening,
No,
finish.
and 10
Go
years
do
ago,
the
I would
kill
have
shot.
been,
Yeah.
yeah. And 10 years ago, I would have been all on board with this. But when you look at how we've handled Iraq and when you look at how we've handled Afghanistan, you look at the people who are calling the shots consistently in foreign policy. These are people who can't find their way out of a paper bag, a wet paper bag. And so the idea that they are going to be competent enough to break Russia while at the same time avoiding a nuclear war or a greater world war is very low. And when you look back at the 90s, I document the history. I found archival evidence. I talked to academic experts um, in Russia, people who were experts on Russia rather. What you find is that particularly under Yeltsin, but also in the first couple years of Putin, the Russian government was very keen on becoming truly a part of the West. NATO was a big stumbling block, though. The Russians kept saying, if you just at least freeze NATO where it is, we can probably do business. We want to do business with you, but we can't help but think this is aimed at us. And, if you were to just show a good faith, we could probably become part of the Western sphere. And then when you look at it, had we done that, had we even just frozen NATO expansion after the Cold War, what have happened was Russia would have become a conduit for us to contain China rather than a doorstop to the Western power projection into Eurasia. So that now if we're serious about containing China, we have to somehow now say either we're going to basically supplicate ourselves before Russia, which is very irate with us, or we're going to have to try to figure out how to break the Russian state into pieces so that our multinational corporations can then move in and absorb the resources and try to contain China through a broken Russia. Well, no one ever talks about, though, what about loose nukes? What about all the loose WMDs? So after World War II, had we listened to Patton, yeah, we could have really gone to town on Russia. But they didn't have nukes back then. Now they've got weapons arsenal that rivals our own. It would be absolute chaos. It would have been a lot easier had we listened to those voices, notably on the American right, people like actually Gene Kirkpatrick, Pat Buchanan, another one of them, who were saying, look, let's not double down on the Cold War mentality. Let's take a step back now from Europe and let the Europeans handle their own issues and let the Russians, who are part of that, let them have a greater say and let those guys figure it out while we rebuild at home and we kind of focus on other things. Instead, we focused on NATO, we focused on Europe, and now we're in a position where you've got a large and massive military power in Russia on the Western doorstep, beating it down. The West is not able to defend clearly itself with a economic juggernaut behind them, which is China. This is a nightmare scenario.
You're gonna tell everybody where to find you? Well, I go use the restroom real quick. Take it away.
Yeah. Yeah, you can find me. I tweet under the title at We the Brandon. I'm also on Truth Social under the same name at We the Brandon, and Getter on at the same name at We the Brandon. I don't normally go on Getter. I'm rarely on Truth Social. You can find me on Twitter. I also have a website, theweichertreport.com, WEICHERT report.com. And you can find my books at Amazon. All four of them. The fourth one coming out is A Disaster of Our Own Making, How the West Lost Ukraine, and that is available now from Encounter Books for pre-order. It will be released October 22nd. All of my books, though, are highly rated. People from Dennis Prager to Stephen Bannon to Gordon Chang, multiple people, as well as many guests that you're familiar with on this show, have all praised the books. And so please do go there and find me. And I'm also widely available on media. If you just type in my name, I'm sure on Google I'll pop up, and many, many other things. But we have to remember that the world is not what it was even 5 years ago. We also have to remember that the destabilization that's going on, the chaos that's been created largely by American policies, has been the result. It's not a natural act. It's not a law of gravity that it was going to go this way. It's primarily because the American elite, for the last 30 years, the bipartisan fusion party, as my colleague Michael Walsh calls them, the American elite of neoconservatives and neoliberals have taken this country down the wrong path. And we are now, 30 years after these bad policies, unfortunately being put in a position where we are going to have to pay.
I just spilled ice cold water where I didn't want ice cold water. Concerning, so one thing I've talked about with you, with Ashton Forbes and Dave Collum, and I've kind of talked to it at length, is, and again, this isn't some like rah rah America. It's again just trying to detach myself and analyze it. Like you with Russia, like I don't care. I'm just watching it. Tying in, Ashton Forbes, MH370, tying in the Senate hearings last year about the UFOs.
Right?
How much of it is that the reason for our kind of just insane belligerency is are we negotiating from a point of just or acting from a point of unimaginable power? I mean, something as groundbreaking as the Manhattan Project or
Right.
stealth technology, and or are we going for broke in Ukraine and Israel and Taiwan because we have this and China has it too, and there is a new mutual assured destruction happening, but
Right.
it's again, it makes hydrogen bombs look like firecrackers. It's like, yeah,
Right.
if we don't do this, the sun might get transported to Chicago. Like,
Right. Right.
like,
Well, and it's something that I recently in the last few days have been chatting with Ashton about. Um, you know, these guys out of the Pentagon, Lou Elizondo, Chris Mellon, all these guys that kind of made their names over the last few years in the public for being, the disclosers of UFO truths from within the government. One of the things they keep saying when they're asked is, well, we have classified clearances and we know what we have and don't have in the arsenals. And we know for a fact that things like transmedium flight are simply not available to any power on Earth, including us. Well, I sent Ashton this article. I write for the Asia Times. It's one of the publications I write for. And there's a gentleman there named Gabriel Hanrada, who's a really savvy tech reporter. And he, in the last few months, wrote an expose about how China actually is developing a hypersonic, supercavitating torpedo that is designed to knock out American aircraft carriers. And it conducts what's known as transmedium flight. What that means is it's launched into the air, travels at a hypersonic velocity, and then in its terminal phase, it drops into the ocean and becomes a torpedo and slams into the carrier underwater. And so when I hear these people who are trying to say, oh, it's UFOs, and we know because we have clearances, I can't help but go, wait a second. You say it's not us or humans in general because you say we are not capable of transmedium flight. Well, apparently the Chinese are. And I thought the Chinese were behind us. So I'm willing to bet if the Chinese are developing transmedium flight, I am sure the people at Lockheed and somewhere else in the American defense apparatus has been developing and experimenting with some kind of transmedium flight. And what I'm getting at here is I am sure that so much of what we're seeing, particularly on those military videos, the Kimball video or
mm-hmm,
the
the
videos
tic
out of
tac.
Virginia. Yeah. The Tic Tac is actually a Navy patent. If
Yeah.
you type in the UFO patents in Google, you will have an article at the War Zone. You follow that article, it will lead you. There's a hyperlink at the top to the UFO patents that are registered at the Patent and Trademark Office. The U.S. Navy, through a guy named Dr. Salvatore Paes,
Mm-hmm.
who I know Ashton knows. U.S. Navy, he's a defense contractor for the Navy, or now he's with the Air Force. But the UFO patents talk about a Tic Tac vehicle that uses what's known as Oh gosh, now I'm forgetting, but it's basically anti-gravity. The specific term is not transmedium, but it's uh I don't remember now. It's in something in wave inducement or something, but I've posted it before on my Twitter in the last couple weeks. I'm sure people can find it there, but you can find it if you Google it, the UFO patents. Okay. So the Tic Tac is actually in the patents for a possible design for how you would make that, what best design would work with a propulsion system like that. It's literally the Tic Tac. And so you look at it's Navy planes doing Navy training exercises in restricted airspace for the Navy off the
It was
coast
a
of
red
Cal.
cell team.
Right.
The for anyone listening, red cell is when you attack, but
Yep.
you send
Exactly.
Delta Force to try to get into the White House. They find a
Yep.
way in, and then the White House plugs it up, and then you try it
Yep.
again. And that's how you get it better and better and better.
Well,
Yeah, yeah. It's
yes,
if you can beat the U.S. Navy, then you can beat anyone.
exactly.
Exactly what it
Exactly.
was.
Yeah. And Salvatore Paese, I said he's with the Air Force now, but he was with I'm trying to remember that. I'm looking up right now the exact unit he was with the Navy. I thought it was okay. NAWCAD. Okay, that's NAWCAD. That's Naval Air Systems Command. Okay, so this is a unit that probably most people have never heard of. More people are probably familiar with, DARPA or even the NGA, which is David Grush's organization, National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, and they're certainly probably more familiar with the NSA than they are with NAWCAD or NavAir or the Air Force Research Laboratory. That's where, at that sub department level, I think a lot of the exotic technologies are being developed so that the top people probably aren't even aware of the details. They're probably not even sure about what's going on. It's so compartmented. You said that it's like a Manhattan project. I actually think it's probably dozens of
Oh.
Manhattan projects going on at once, all feeding into the same beast. And so what you're seeing in the skies and what these Navy pilots think they're seeing, it ain't aliens. And these guys like Fravor, who seems like a stand-up guy, a real patriot, but when he says like under oath, oh well, I have a clearance and I know for a fact this isn't our stuff. I'm like, no, I have worked with the government long enough to know there are various levels of clearances. You may have a high clearance as a fighter pilot, but there's probably clearances far above yours, and they are not going to tell you. And even if you do have the right level of clearance, compartmentalization
Mm-hmm.
across private
Need
sector
to know.
has absolutely. So there's no way any one person can step forward. Not even the former Undersecretary of Defense, like Chris Mellon, could reliably step forward and say, I absolutely know these programs do not exist. This is not human technology. I'm
Mhm.
sorry, but I don't buy it for a second, not for 1 second. And if we've got it, you can rest assured on some level, the Russians probably have it, and definitely the Chinese probably pilfered it from us.
Mm. It almost makes you think of like the B-21 Raider is like a canard, like
Yeah,
trying to steal. You let them steal all the R&D, and they dump in all their resources to build a fleet of those. Meanwhile, we're like, dude, the B-21 was like, that's old
right,
crap. We're pulling out of.
right.
We're doing the triple orb endothermic
Well,
explosion
absolutely.
Alcubierre. Like,
Absolutely. But also, you have to remember it's probable that we are investing in what we would call conventional technologies still because we don't want to let the world know yet that, hey, we've got this stuff.
you don't want to have to use the royal flush.
Exactly.
You're right. I
Exactly.
mean, you
Right.
know, Truman gave the order to, if needed, drop the third bomb, but no
Right.
one knew we only had three. It was they have
Right.
one and they do it another, and it's like, oh, they might do a third, they might do a 10th. They had no
Right.
idea,
Right.
right?
And
I think
so, right.
at one point in Garrett Graff's Raven Rock to talk about Truman like meeting with, I don't know, the head of like Oak Ridge, Tennessee or something, and it was like he wanted to know how big the real arsenal was, and it was like so secret they had to deliver
Right.
it. He didn't even write it. I think he went and like told Truman like, I don't know, somewhere in like the Rose Garden. It was just like a
Right.
whisper, and Truman was like, the Soviets thought we had like 350,
Right.
and the general was like, we have 13.
Right.
Right. And it's
Right.
like, I mean, and when Truman was he a senator before he was VP? Was
Yeah.
he?
He was senator from
He was
Missouri.
he was in charge of like hunting down defense contractors like double
Right.
dipping,
Right.
and that is also in Raven Rock by Garrett Graff, and he was chasing down all these resources and all this money and all this electricity somewhere in Tennessee, and like they weren't
Yep.
producing anything. And he was
Right.
like, and he went and reported it back up the chain, and he was like, I'm here to like rat out corruption. And eventually, Leslie Groves talked to him. They're like, hey, he said, you're doing a great job. Back off. And
Right.
Truman was like, all right.
Right.
And then 13 days into his presidency, when he became president, Leslie Groves briefed him 13 days after he was inaugurated that we had the A
Right.
bomb. And Truman was like, that's what that was.
Yeah.
But think
Mm,
about that. Like,
right.
so that's not even like some wild like feasibility. It's
Right.
just literal historical
Right.
precedence.
And we're
Why
and we're
wouldn't it happen
testing,
again?
yeah, and we're testing these systems, probably not telling the Navy, we're testing these systems against them because we need to know if they work. Because what's going to happen when the shooting war begins, we don't have enough conventional forces to stop the war. The war starts, it's going to be a bloody, nasty war. We're going to need the royal flush. We're going to need something to come in. Otherwise, we're going to lose. Because I can tell you right now, if it's a conventional war with just conventional technology, China is close enough to us in conventional technology terms. In fact, in certain areas, you and I have spoken about this, in certain areas, they're ahead of us. That if it comes down to that, the likelihood the Americans can win is going to be very low. Now, maybe it doesn't end in like an invasion of the United States, but it's going to end in a strategic defeat for the US. So we're going to need something. We're going to
Mm.
need something in Ukraine. We're looking at this right now in Ukraine. And I talk about this in my next book. Um, there is a problem where the Ukrainian military, despite everything we're giving them, can't do it. And now the French are talking about sending in their armed forces to basically go into Western Ukraine and stop a Russian run on Western Ukraine, which will then trigger a wider war. And in that condition, I don't believe, short of some nuclear exchange or some kind of radical new technology being deployed by us, I don't think we can win.
The opening chapter of Skunkworks by Ben Rich talks about when
Yeah,
they're testing the F-117. They told the guys they told the guys inside like the radar like container, basically like see if you can see the plane coming. They didn't tell them that it was was like the T6 or the T4, like the
yeah.
trainer followed by the F-117. And they saw it and they were like they were all cocky and they were like, yeah, we spotted it. There it is. Then like the F-117 flies over and they're like, did you get the second plane? And they're like, what are you talking about? And like by the time it had like flown over and it was like the JDAM would have hit you already.
Right.
And then the guy higher up, who was still below Ben Rich, was like, Ben Rich told him, he was like, there was like a sphere in the nose cone of the F-117, and that's what blocked the radar
Yep.
on the off chance that that guy's a mole, not knowing at all that it was the actual geometric structure of it. So it's like,
Yes.
again, there's precedence for this. You don't even have to go back to the Manhattan Project. This was what in '79.
Right.
Like
Right.
it's right there. And then
Right.
I always think, man, it's like James Bamford's Shadow Factory
Mm-hmm.
talks about how like the NSA bought up an apartment complex that was on a hill near Fort Meade
Yep.
because they're like we don't want them getting
Yep.
what is it called there's a type of like radiation from tempest radiation. They're like they don't want that from the Chinese. So and even in like DC, right? There's only certain places where you can't buy something in like I don't know a sniper range of the Oval
Right.
Office. So when I look at Elon Musk like having Starlink, you don't just waltz on up there and go, here's 30,000 kinetic
Right.
objects. So I start looking at that, start thinking about Ash and Forbes, and I'm like, is that whole thing? Are there orbs hidden in that? Do they each have orb technology? What if that's Star Wars? You shoot an
Yeah.
ICBM up, zoop, and it just goes through it, and just, either
Well,
you portal it to Pluto or you shoot it right back down where I mean, like,
well, yeah, I don't know about that aspect of it, but I do know that Starlink scares the hell out of the Russians and the
well,
Chinese.
my point is, regardless, is like you
Right.
don't get that real estate by just like, oh, I'm just gonna
Right.
go put internet up there.
Right.
Uh-huh.
Of course.
Really?
Of
Really?
course.
Yeah,
Of
really? You're
course.
just
Right.
the Pentagon's just like, good luck.
Right. Well,
Shut
because
up.
also it's a test bed. Starlink is a test bed for Star Shield, which
That
is Musk's actual Starlink for the military that he's got the contract for in the last 6 months, and he's
I'm
building.
gonna write that down right
So
now.
it's Star Shield. There's
Starship.
Starlink for the civilians. Star Shield for the military.
Yeah,
And
and
I think it
that's
was with Space Command was the contract. So
and
not with
then
Space Force
yeah,
direct.
and then is Starlink, maybe it's not something like maybe it's not some orb technology. Maybe it's just the Russians' fractional orbital bombardment system. Maybe there's just 30,000 kinetic kill vehicles up there.
Well, remember when the Russians, all that news came out like a month ago about, oh, the Russians are putting a nuke in orbit. They're putting nukes in orbit, and I don't remember. It might have been you. I was talking to somebody at the time, and I was like, this is not news. This is old technology. This
Yeah.
this is stuff we were doing in the Cold
Yeah,
War.
yeah,
They actually made a movie, a very fun movie about this, a fictional movie, but it was based on actual things that were going on. Back in the 2000s, the movie was called Space Cowboys, and it was with Tommy Lee Jones and Clint Eastwood.
oh yeah,
Uh,
and they go up and it's like an old like
an old Soviet,
SDI.
yeah,
I
and
didn't
it
watch it,
turns
but I
out that
knew of it.
it's a
Yeah.
FOBS. It
Yeah.
turns out that it's a malfunctioning FOBS. They
Yeah.
were told it was a weather satellite. It's actually a
Yeah.
FOBS. So this is stuff that we've been doing for decades. And so what I'm getting at is, now it's 30 years of American hegemony. Unfortunately, it's over. We did it to ourselves. We ended it ourselves. And now you're seeing first right now you've been witnessing the slow rise of China through non-military means, economic, cultural, things like that. You now right now are experiencing the brutal return of Russia. And contrary to what all the experts are saying, Russia's not collapsing. Russia's actually being strengthened by the war.
Mm.
Russia has actually worked out the kinks in their defense industrial base, and they're now putting people in charge of these systems who are actual experts, who are actually brilliant people who can actually manage as well as any of our people can these systems, and they are going to be honing those systems now into a war winning next generation technological hub that is not dependent on the West for its resources. So before, Russia's defense industrial base was very dependent on Western resources. That's why the sanctions were initially having quite a bite. But the last few years, they've really worked hard on divorcing themselves from relying on Western technological components, getting it from places like China, getting it from India, and they're now building their own indigenous defense industrial base that is outstripping the American defense industrial base. You can now extrapolate from that and say, when we're talking about exotic technology or even just next generation technology, if these trends persist, even Russia will be able to outstrip the Americans on some level simply because they have spent so much time honing that defense industrial base, whereas we have not.
And also just thinking like I think it was in 1990, the one of like the kinetic kill vehicles. You can find the video on YouTube where it's
Mm-hmm.
just shooting at the little rockets left, right. It's just it's
Mm-hmm.
eerie. And it's like that's 34 years old.
Right.
It might not need to be some warp drive stuff. It might just be that there
Yep.
are 30,000 of those. They just, hidden somewhere underneath
Yep.
a panel is just like a little tiny, not advanced technology, just a little RCS thruster.
Yep.
They have 30,000 instead of, and if you launched 30,000 kill vehicles, that would be very obvious that you're preparing for an
Yep.
enemy strike or that you're preemptively blocking them from the strike you're about to launch.
Yep.
Or you just throw it up there as
A
internet
deterrent.
and it has
Yeah.
great PR. It's we will
Yep.
not, Wi-Fi for Ukraine, Wi-Fi
Right.
for South America. We won't stop censorship. Man, eh, all the
Yep.
precedence is there.
It is, and what it's leading to though is a very unstable world environment. And
Or more stable.
in the long run, Edward Lutwack talks about this all the time. He has I recommend your audience is when I taught, I used to make the students read this. There's an article he wrote in 96 or 7 for Foreign Affairs called Give War a Chance. And Ed Lutwack makes the argument, at the time he was raging against the humanitarian intervention against Serbia. He was saying it's a waste. We shouldn't be doing it because what war is it's the ultimate form of state building. And he uses the example of Rwanda, which was very recent at the time he wrote it. And in Rwanda, you had the greatest bloodletting, the greatest massacring of human beings in a single night since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And it was a horrible event. And it's something that still blights American foreign policy in terms of how people view it. But ultimately, today, 30 years later, Rwanda is one of the most stable economies and countries of Africa. So, as terrible as that event was, it was a ultimate tool of state building. And it was probably good that the Americans chose not to intervene to stop that horrible event from happening, because in the long term, Rwanda ended up being better off. And so you're right. In the long term, major conflict, if it doesn't lead to nuclear assured destruction, could end up reshaping the world into a better, more equitable, more efficient place. But in the process, it's going to be very bloody. And how are we, as the United States, which is we are not in our best condition today, certainly not our best leadership, how are we going to survive this with minimal losses, with minimal inconveniences? How do we protect our way of life? That's the real question. And right now, it's really up in the air, because you could be right. This thing could end up being like a Cold War 2.0 or even a World War, and it could see the Eastern Bloc winning. And what
Mm.
does that look like for America? Because that's what I care about.
Yeah, obviously, yeah.
Yeah.
I
I mean,
I
look
don't
what
know.
happened to Russia when they lost the Cold War.
Yeah,
The whole place
total,
imploded.
total,
It was
yeah.
terrible.
Yeah, I don't know
Happy.
why I do these episodes. I don't know why. I'm like, what is the point of like getting 8 hours of sleep, meditating, exercising, keeping my heart rate low? And then I
Well,
do these episodes and I finish
you
and I'm like,
you do
oh,
these episodes, you talk to people like me, and I always tell people I'm not just a doomer. If you read my work, they're always the last half or the last third are solutions.
mhm,
What I try to do is bring up worst case scenarios so that you or your audience or policymakers, whoever I'm talking to, can maybe game out in their heads with this information. How do we come up with programs and policies that allows us to avoid these worst case scenarios? Because so often, in particularly Washington, D.C., they don't think, they think about like the war of 50 years from now. And
yeah,
it turns out it's probably not how warfare is going to be. Okay. So, what we need to be doing is we need to understand what's in front of us right now. We need to understand there's a limited set of options we have. And if we don't make the right choices in the next 3 to 7 years, the nightmare scenarios are going to play out. So,
yeah.
let's avoid those. And so, we talk about the doom so that we can avoid the gloom. Okay.
That's the logic I'll use to keep myself from making. Um,
That's certainly why I can smile even though I'm talking about this.
yeah, it's well, look at it this way. If the technologies we're talking about exist, they're so advanced that you won't even feel it.
Right,
So
right,
gone.
right.
But yeah, Brandon, let's wrap this one up for now. Thanks for doing
Yep.
this on short notice, man. Guys,
Thanks for
please go to
having
the
me.
description. Please go grab his books. Please go to his website. Please go to follow his Twitter, all that good stuff. And till next time, man. Thank you so much.
Until we meet again.
All right, brother. Thank you so much,
Yeah.
guys. Thank